Good morning. I'm thankful for the opportunity to stand before you today. I'd like to welcome all that are out, especially those that are visiting. We're thankful that you're here, and we hope that you'll find that everything that we do here is according to God's word, and that you'll be edified by worshiping with us this morning. As most of us know, the fourth Sunday night, another man speaks for Brother Hall. And so I suggest that if you are one that does speak from time to time, you check the list in the back to see when you're down. Or you'll be surprised like me, as last Sunday morning when I walked in the door, I found out it was my night to preach. Luckily, Brother Hall had also forgotten about it being the fourth Sunday, and he had prepared 2 lessons. And so I made a deal with him and said, if you'll preach last Sunday night, I'll speak for you this morning. So that is the reason for me speaking to you today. But I do encourage you to check that and see when you might be down to speak. I hope that everything I have to say will be beneficial to us all. It was to me. And that we'll gain from the things that we read and things that I have down and have prepared to speak to you. I'd also like to make mention that this is an outline that I'm using of Brother David Riggs. That's a name that probably many of us that are older that grew up here recognize. Brother Riggs has been gone for several years now, but it's good to know that his work and the efforts that he put forth so many years ago are still being used today. And I hope that he'd be happy that I used his outline this morning. You know, as Christians, we always have to be watchful. And we have to be on guard against the devil and the forces of evil that are around us. And the Bible warns us multiple times to not be deceived. We can be deceived by some person or some outside source. And, maybe that same source or that same person can correct us. Or maybe we can even see the error of our ways where we've been deceived and correct ourselves. But the most difficult and tragic of all deceptions is when we deceive ourselves. And so there are 5 passages that I want to look at this morning that instruct and warn us against the dangers of self-deception. The first one is a warning against the over-evaluation of our own wisdom. And that first verse is in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So if you'd like to turn over, we'll be reading 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. Here Paul says, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, he catches the wise in their own craftiness." I think mankind has always had a problem with flaunting our own wisdom. I'm sure we've seen those who constantly spit out information, maybe just trying to impress someone with their knowledge, or those who feel their opinion on a topic must be heard, is the only true and correct opinion and option that there is. The wise man has some things to say about this in warning us. Over in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." How many times have we leaned on our own understanding? We may have done so and found out it was a mistake. He says here to trust in the Lord with all your heart. In all your ways acknowledge him. All is a small 3-letter word, not a very big word, but it has a lot of meaning, has a very big meaning. We may have some knowledge. We may have some abilities that allow us to do great things. But if we do, it's only because they were given to us from the Lord. We must never forget that, and we must always have our hearts fully set on trusting God in all situations. Many folks are wise in their own eyes, and it usually shows. We can see it in others, but oftentimes we are blind when it comes to ourselves. Still in Proverbs, but chapter 26, and in verse 12, it says, "Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than him." When a person's wise in their own eyes, it's very hard for them to be taught or corrected. This verse says that a fool has a better chance. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 17, we find Christians who thought themselves to be one way, but were indeed something completely different. In verse 17 of Revelation 3, it says, "Because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. What a huge contrast of what they thought they were and what the reality actually was. Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 21 says, "Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." The B part of Revelation chapter 12 and verse 16 says, "Do not be wise in your own opinion." The King James Version uses the word conceits instead of opinion. And the word conceits means an excessive appreciation of one's own worth or virtues. Over in Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 25, Romans 1, beginning with verse 22, it says, "Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." This verse says, "Professing to be wise, they became fools." The complete opposite of what they thought and what they claimed to be. Verse 25 speaks of worshiping the creature instead of the Creator. And if you think about it, in our day of selfies and blogs and vlogs and TikToks and all other look-at-me social media platforms, how many are truly worshiping themselves? They may have 1 million followers, and because they do, that automatically makes them an expert on relationships, on politics, on money, on religion, on spirituality, etc. The scriptures teach us that we must become fools to be acceptable to God. And it's not fools in an ignorant and unlearned sense, but in how we are looked upon by the world. In 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 25, this passage talks about the message of the cross being foolishness to those who are perishing. It says, "God was pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." We might ask, and why? It's because the foolishness of God is wiser than man. How many in this world probably think it's foolish to get up every Sunday morning and go to worship services? How many think it's silly to be baptized in a baptistry in a thing of water in order to be saved? Or that we only sing and we don't play instruments? Wouldn't it be so much prettier if it was accompanied by music? It's foolishness to the world. Verse 19 of 1 Corinthians 1 says, "It is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." Again, in our text on this point, Paul says in verse 18 of 1 Corinthians 3, "Let him become a fool that he may become wise." And if we have to become foolish in their eyes in order to be wise and pleasing to God, so be it. The second way that we can deceive ourselves is by being hearers only. If you would turn to James chapter 1. James chapter 1, we'll read verses 22 through 25. James 1, beginning in verse 22. It says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does." Here, James uses the example of a man looking at himself in a mirror. We probably all looked at ourselves in a mirror this morning before we got here. If a man looks in a mirror and he doesn't make any changes, doesn't wash his face, comb his hair, wipe the sleep out of his eyes, it will do him no good. He will walk away and he'll immediately forget what he looked like because he doesn't care. It is the same with us when we look into the mirror of the perfect law of liberty and we see our reflection through it. We see our true reflection. When we let it show us how we are. And when we let it show us how we are, we still make no changes. Only those who do the will of God will be saved. Hearing is important, but it takes so much more. We have a very familiar passage in Matthew chapter 7. I think Shane may have even referenced it this morning in his Bible study, in our Bible class. In Matthew chapter 7, beginning with verse 21. And it says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.' Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." It's really very simple. We have to hear and we have to do. You know, if someone told me that they would give me $1 million if I go outside and mow the grass, I think we understand what we might need to do. But I might come back and say, well, I heard them say I would get $1 million, so where is it? Well, you didn't mow the grass. But I heard him say I would get $1 million. But you didn't do what you had to get the $1 million. You know, it's pretty easy to see the silliness in that line of thinking, but it's so very hard when it comes to spiritual things. Just as we are not saved by hearing only, we're also not saved by faith only. In James chapter 2 and verse 17, it says, "Also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." Again, I could have faith that if I mowed the yard, I would get $1 million. But just because I believe that doesn't ensure me the reward. I have to do something. Those who say they believe in faith only really don't. You know, first they think that you must believe in God, in Jesus, and accept Christ as our Savior. You know, that's something you've got to do. Also, many of those who follow that doctrine attend services regularly. They contribute, they help the needy, they attend Bible studies. We might ask, why do any of that if it really doesn't matter, if all we have to do is have faith? We've got to be active in living the Christian life. There are countless members of the Lord's church who attend services every time the doors are opened. They hear the gospel preached over and over, yet never let it change them. They never make any kind of response in action to being Christ-like. We oftentimes speak of becoming indifferent, apathetic, lukewarm. Our hearts are not in the service to God. We do it more out of routine or maybe habit, more than out of a desire to serve and out of thankfulness. Or maybe we just quit it altogether. The Israelites had the same problem. In Malachi 1 and verse 13, they were saying, "Oh, what a weariness, and you sneer at it, says the Lord of hosts. You bring the stolen, the lame, and the sick. Thus you bring an offering. Should I accept this from your hand, says the Lord?" You know, they were half-heartedly serving. They were bringing the lame and the sick and even the stolen as their sacrifices to God. It wasn't of their first fruits. They were weary of serving. How many times do we get this way? Oh, what a burden it is to have to get up on Sunday mornings and go to worship. Or if we're here, we're half asleep, we're distracted by our phones, we're daydreaming, we're thinking about what we're going to have for lunch. And the Lord is asking us this same question: should I accept this from you? In Nehemiah chapter 13, the Israelites were profaning the Sabbath. We know that we are not instructed to keep the Sabbath day holy, but they were. There were things that they weren't supposed to do on the Sabbath. Yet here they were, treading the wine presses. They were bringing in the sheaves. They were loading donkeys. They were selling goods. They were completely forsaking the command of keeping the Sabbath day holy. Like I said, we don't keep the Sabbath today, but how many Christians, in parentheses or in quotation marks, profane the Lord's day by working, gardening, fishing, golfing, going to ball games, sleeping, traveling, whatever you want to fill in there, rather than honoring God and honoring Christ in worship. You know, we deceive ourselves if we think this type of living will get us into heaven. The third way we may deceive ourselves is at saying that we have no sin. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 8, John says, "If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. When one says, I have no sin, or I do not sin, they are immediately in sin because they're lying and because of their pride. Sin has many deceptions, and it will use them all to get to us. In Hebrews chapter 3, and in verse 13, it says, But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. One of the greatest deceptions that we may sometimes be faced with is that sin is not sin. And if we aren't careful, we can tell ourselves that enough and we will be convinced. Society today wants no one telling them what they're doing is wrong. How dare you judge me? You do what seems right to you, and I will do what seems right to me. What a deceptive way of thinking. How can we confess our sin as we're instructed to if we don't know that it's a sin, or if we refuse to admit that we do sin? Along with thinking we have no sin, another great deception is that we can sin and still get into heaven. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 8, Paul says, Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. We will reap what we sow. If it's not in this lifetime, it will for sure be in the one to come. Over in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 11, the wise man says, Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. The punishment for an evil deed may not come quickly. This can make us think that there's no punishment at all for the wrong. And it might push us to sin over and over and over. But punishment will come. Again, in Ecclesiastes, this time chapter 12 and verse 14, it says, For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Every work. That says a lot. This every will include what others may not even know about. Maybe what only we know. But it will be remembered and it will be accounted against us in that great day. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, in verses 9 through 10, it says, Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. And we don't need to deceive ourselves that wickedness and sin will make it to heaven. This verse says the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. Whenever we realize that we've sinned, we must repent. These Christians in Corinth had been some of these things that we just read about. And these are some pretty serious sins if you get down to it and get to looking at what's listed here. But they had been washed, they had been sanctified, and they had been justified. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9, we're told that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Proverbs 28 verse 13 says, He who covers his sin will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. Let's not be deceived into thinking that we have no sin or that we can live in sin and still enjoy the joys of heaven when this life is over, because it won't happen. Another deception by which we can fool ourselves is that we are stronger than we actually are. Of course, this strength that I'm referring to is not physical strength, but spiritual strength. Again, back over in Galatians chapter 6, and in verse 3, it says, For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. We can think pretty highly of ourselves sometimes. In Romans 12 and verse 3, we are warned not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. As I've kind of already alluded to, it's difficult many times for us to see our own weaknesses or our own faults. It's hard to see the beam that is in our eye. We may question, how could someone do something? How could they do this certain thing? Or we might say, I will never do that. I would never find myself in that situation. Humility is a very important characteristic in the Christian life. We can see humility defined in several ways. And I saw a definition that said, humility is an attitude of spiritual modesty that comes from understanding our place in the larger order of things. This world doesn't revolve around us. And the quicker we learn that, the better off we'll be. Proverbs 22 and verse 4 says that by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Colossians 3 and verse 12 tells us to put on humility, among some other things. 1 Peter 5 and verse 5 says we are to be clothed with humility because God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. We all need grace. And if we're clothed with humility, I believe it will be seen. We've already looked at the last part of Romans chapter 12 and verse 16, but I want to read the entire verse in relation to this point. It says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. The admonition that Paul is giving here is to associate with the humble. Spend time with the right folks. There are types of people that we can let influence us for good. And then we're told at the end there again to not be wise in our own opinion. Pride can be a very strong deceiver. Over in Obadiah, a book that we don't go to very often, it seems like in lessons or Bible studies, in Obadiah, just one chapter, but verses 3 through 4 says, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, who will bring me to the ground? Though you ascend as high as the eagle, and though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. And we may tell ourselves that no one can bring us down, but God can. In a very similar passage to this one, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 16, it says, your fierceness has deceived you, the pride of your heart. Pride will overtake our hearts if we let it. If we let it grow there. In Proverbs chapter 18, verses 10 through 12, it says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his own esteem. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Do we put our trust in riches and things? Is that where we run to find our protection instead of to God? Here, haughtiness equates to destruction. But on the opposite of that, humility leads to honor. Proverbs 16 and verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Once we become overconfident in our spiritual strength, we're leading ourselves to a very drastic fall. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and in verse 12, it says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We can find ourselves with a false sense of security sometimes. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 27 through 30, we have a great example of someone who showed overconfidence, leading to a big fall. And that's the example of the Apostle Peter. I want to read those verses in Mark chapter 14, beginning with verse 27, reading through verse 30. It says, then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. But it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you, that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And we all know what happened. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Peter was quick to stand firm in his word, but he didn't follow it up with actions. If Peter a close friend, a close acquaintance of Christ, an apostle who had walked with him, who had seen the miracles, who had seen all that he had done, can fall, don't you think that it's very easy that we can do the same? Let's all walk in humility before God and men. Let's not deceive ourselves into thinking that we are stronger than we actually are. And then the fifth and final way that we can deceive ourselves is by not bridling our tongue. Over in James chapter 1, and in verse 26, James says, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Up in verse 16 of this same chapter, James addresses those he's writing to as beloved brethren. So I think we can take it that these are Christians. These are worshipers of God. You know, how many Christians today consider themselves to be very religious, very faithful in their service to God, but their tongues flap with no abandon? And we need to ask ourselves, are we that way? If we are, then our religion is useless. That's a very sad statement, I think. We've discussed what James had to say about hearing and not doing in our first point. He now tells us how doing without bridling our tongues makes our worship vain and useless. The tongue, I think, is definitely one of the biggest weaknesses of the human race. I've often seen a list of things that can't be taken back, and many times on that list is the word once it's spoken. You can apologize for it, but the word can't be erased. James tells us a whole lot about the tongue and about the dangers of its misuse. In James chapter 3, we'll read verses 2 through 10. James chapter 3, beginning with verse 2, says, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships, although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men, who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Compared to the rest of the body, the tongue is pretty small, but man, it can do a whole lot of damage if it's not used properly. In these verses, it's compared to a fire, and I think we all know just the smallest of sparks can set ablaze, which can destroy thousands of acres, can destroy homes, can kill people. If you remember, the old Smokey the Bear ads would tell us only you can prevent forest fires. Well, these types of fires that I'm talking about that are set by the tongue can only be prevented by us as well. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29 says, let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth. No corrupt word. Verse 31 says to let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you. James 4:11 says, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Proverbs 12 and verse 22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. And a lying tongue is also listed as one of the things that the Lord hates in Proverbs 6 and verse 17. You know, our words can feed a fire. Even if it's not a fire we started, if it's not even a spark that maybe we set, it can still feed it. Over in Proverbs again, verse 26, beginning with verse 20, it says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. As charcoal is to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. we can keep that fire going. Gossip, a lot of times, is fun to hear. It's interesting. We want to know what's going on. We have to be careful about that. We have to be careful that we're not continuing to feed that fire, keeping the wood and the coal and whatever it is it takes to keep it going on there. A gossip can destroy friendships. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 28, it says, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Our words can pierce like a sword. They can be strong and they can be destructive. Proverbs 12 and verse 18 says, there is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword. I think there are definitely situations where our words will not always be sweet. There are times when we may have some things to say that are harsh, but they're truthful, things that need to be heard. But that can always be done in the proper way. The rest of verse 18 of Proverbs 12 says, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. We will stumble and we will fall with our tongue and words. Again, James chapter 3 and verse 2 says, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. We are not and we will not be perfect. There was only one man who accomplished this. But when we do sin with our tongues, we must correct it. We must repent. We must try to work it out as best we can, and then continue to work harder to keep that tongue bridled. Let our religion not be deemed useless, and we only think we are religious because our tongues are not under control. We can be our own worst enemy. I think we've probably all heard that statement. We may have even said that statement before. We can deceive ourselves just as easily as someone else can, but we are the only ones that can stop it. We have the control over our choices. We have the control over what we let manipulate us, what we let deceive us. And when we truly recognize ourselves as a potential deadly enemy, hopefully it will cause us to be more on guard. Hopefully it will cause us to be more watchful of who and what we allow to influence and shape our attitudes and our decisions and choices. So, as a reminder, let's not deceive ourselves. Let's not deceive ourselves by an over-evaluation of our own wisdom. Let's not deceive ourselves by just being hearers only and not doing what we're told to do. By saying that we have no sin or that we do not sin. By thinking that we're stronger spiritually than we actually are. And lastly, by not bridling our tongues. Again, as I said at the beginning, I hope that what I've had to say was beneficial. It was to me. Hopefully it was to you and those that are here or that may even be listening online. If you're here this morning and maybe you found that you have deceived yourself or you've let someone else deceive you, you realize that and realize that you need to make correction. Today, right now, is a perfect opportunity to do that. You might have deceived yourself into thinking that you're not in sin at all and have never rendered obedience to the gospel of Christ. Maybe that's something you've deceived yourself into thinking that you don't have to do. Again, now is a great opportunity to correct yourself, to not be deceived, to do what God tells us to do, to obey his word. So if anyone has any need, we'd plead and ask that you come while we stand and sing the invitation.